Part of the calling that I've had in my role as district superintendent that the district leadership team talked to me about was really getting an assessment, my perspective on what was really happening within the local churches, but more importantly, what was happening in the pastors and ministry leaders' lives. And as we have formed and met over the last 3.5 years in terms of looking at how district ministry can be much more intentional and actually meeting where the churches and ministry leaders are at, we've thought through how can we bring in different speakers and workshops and so forth that will be most beneficial to where most of us are really at in terms of our ministry and our relationship with Jesus. I had an opportunity to meet Alan. He probably doesn't remember it, but it was in January of 2020 in Orlando at a Sun Life discipleship conference that they were there. And I was just overwhelmed by what God had revealed through what he was speaking about, which was areas that I really struggled in. And part of it is what we just sang, trusting. Can I really trust Jesus in the midst of my work and my rest? And the reality is, I was not very good at resting. My personality type and so forth is one in which I then affects my work because I become much more workaholic, a control freak, all those kind of things that can happen if you really don't understand what you're really not getting in terms of God's perspective on the gospel in your own life and the life of Jesus. We're to learn from him, right? We're to be yoked with him, we're to abide with him, and following Jesus in the midst of that is what Alan really challenged me in. And so as we looked at the kind of 1.2 sides of what we're seeking to really emphasize with all of us in terms of our following of Jesus is what does it really mean to be a healthy follower of Jesus Christ and all the aspects of what that looks like. So that when we develop leaders, we help develop healthy leaders. I've had to repent a lot. I had to go to my staff and others because I wasn't represented that well and they were feeling anxiety, which we'll hear about tomorrow, because of how I was living as a follower of Jesus. And so there's a lot of different tributaries that affected and have impacted my life of being connected with Unhurried Living and reading Alan's books, now being a part of their PACE program, which is to learn how to be a better leader in the context where God has me. That my discipleship has to include this aspect of what, in terms of the inner life and soul care and those kind of things with the people that I've given responsibility for and influence with. So Alan is a husband, Jim, how many years now? 40. A father of 3. He is a pastor, he's a spiritual director, he's a leader, he's a coach. He's a lot of different things in relationship with people, and I'm so glad he's in my life. I'm going to let him introduce a little bit more about his life and ministry and his journey that he's had. But if you turn to page 10 is where we'll start today. And how it will go is he'll do some teaching, then there'll be some times of reflection and talking with each other, and so forth over the next couple of days. So would you give a warm welcome to Alan Fadling.
Well, it's good to be able to come and spend today and a part of tomorrow with you all. I'd like to just start by saying thank you for what you do. This is my 41st year in paid church or nonprofit ministry. I don't know if there's been a harder 5 years of the 40 than these last 5. The conflicts that sometimes you have to navigate. Everyone expects you to agree with their political convictions or their feelings about certain public initiatives But I began in ministry 41 years ago because Jesus did something in my life. As a senior in high school, having grown up in a non-religious, unchurched family, I just met some wild and crazy Jesus followers. And And that was my introduction to the Christian life. Jesus is just remarkable. As Dallas Willard said, there's nobody smarter than Jesus. Nobody you'd rather spend some time with than Jesus. No one more winsome. No one whose presence you would more enjoy than to just be with Jesus for a bit. And by the Spirit, we get to do that every single day, any given moment. So maybe just kind of along the way, I'll get a chance to share some of what I do in terms of our nonprofit, Unhurried Living. But I'd like to start by just sharing, first of all, that it's been a great joy to get to know Barry and to walk together as brothers for a bit now. And I'm so grateful for his invitation to come and be with you. Unhurried. What in the world does that mean? How in the world could that be good? I think people look at me and think, you must not get much done. All this unhurried business. You spend a lot of time on your recliner watching ESPN, you know? And what I want to say is, I get more done unhurried than I do frantically hurried. Peace is a better source of fuel than anxiety is. Unhurried is the pace at which every fruit of the Spirit flourishes. Not one of them flourishes in a hurry. Love people in a hurry. People don't enjoy that much. Joy is different than excitement. It's deeper, it's more rooted. Peace, patience, there's your unhurried virtue par excellence. So when I talk about unhurried, I'm not really talking about your walking speed or your freeway speed or your talking speed or your working speed. Dallas Willard used to say, there's a difference between busy and hurried. Busy, that's your calendar. Jesus had busy days, didn't he? The crowd just kept coming from sunrise till past sunset. Busy. Busy is your calendar. Hurried, that's your soul. That's what's happening in here. When we're hurried in here, it's harder to be present to God. It's harder to be present to the people God brings across the paths. It's harder even just to be where we are, in this place, in this moment. When I'm hurried, I'm about 10% here and about 90% somewhere else, like next, whatever's next. That's where I am. You've been there, haven't you? You're having a conversation and you're chatting, and pretty soon their gaze kind of goes 5 degrees off. It's like, oh, they've already left, though their body is still here. Have you ever done that? Like me? Unhurried says the only place you can be is here. The only time you can be is now. God is here. You are here. The people here are here. It's the only thing you've got going. Sitting here means there's things back home you're not getting done. Right? When we were quiet a minute ago, for a minute, what happened in your head? In mine was a couple things I forgot to do before I got on the plane yesterday. So it's very tempting to be there, not to be here. That's hurried. This is unhurried. So I'm just trying to give you a feel for what I mean by unhurried. I think it's inviting. I think it's the pace of the kingdom. Someone has said, God is never in a hurry. Think how long it takes to grow one of our California sequoias. Centuries. If you planted an oak tree in your front yard for some shade, you're going to be waiting a while. The best things simply take time. Eugene Peterson used to love to talk about a long obedience in the same direction. So one of the joys of being in my 60s now is I've had the joy of walking with Jesus for 40 years. and having been mentored by some men and some friends who really helped me to remember that the Christian life is about Jesus. Shocking, isn't it? Like nobody hear me there? Ministry for me had become frantically filling my calendar with great stuff to do. I lost touch with ministry as, yes, doing a lot of really good things with Jesus in the service of others. So again, when I talk about unhurried, I'm talking about our souls. So what does hurried look like for me? Sometimes hurry looks like a frantic, anxious drivenness to just get one more thing done in the day as though my life depended on it. Sometimes my hurry looks like anxiety. My most recent book, A Non-Anxious Life, when I proposed it to the publisher, this was the sentence I said. The more I talk with Christian leaders about hurry, the more I realize how often it is rooted in some variety of anxiety. Anxiety has driven a lot of the things I've done over the decades. In the end, anxiety isn't one of the fruits of the Spirit. It's not in that list of 9. Peace is, anxiety isn't. Or sometimes my hurry has looked like a frantic and deep-seated craving for the affirmation and the approval of the people I'm serving. I share that I went into ministry, as I said a minute ago, because Jesus had made such a remarkable difference in my life. And I wanted people to know him. I wanted people to encounter him. And so very quickly I realized I wanted to be involved in ministry, and in our circles that meant becoming a pastor. And now I know you can be in ministry in a lot of places. But at that point, that's where my path seemed to be taken. I went into ministry partly because of what God was doing in my life. I went into ministry partly, too, because I was in a church that highly treasured the study and the teaching of Scriptures. And I loved to study. I was one of those weird young 20-somethings who would read commentaries. They're not supposed to be read, right? I just couldn't get enough. I'd pick a biblical book and I'd just start reading commentaries. And then I couldn't wait to share what I was learning, but what I really learned was when someone would say, "Oh, that's a great insight, Alan." That was like crack for my recognition-starved soul. Oh, I want more of that. Now, at its base, that's not just wicked, but it's not best. It's not best when you bring your thirsts to your people hoping they'll serve you. It's better if you come satisfied to give an abundance to the people you serve. And that's something I'm learning still in my 60s. I go to my work, I go to communities I serve, I hope, with a cup that overflows, like Psalm 23 says. I try not to go with a cup that's mostly empty. It just works better. Again, unhurried, in part, is about that. So the focus of this session is what I call the pace of an unhurried Savior. My proposed title for An Unhurried Life, my first book, the very first proposed title was something like Jesus, an Unhurried Savior. And so if you look at a number of the chapters, they really focus on ways in which Jesus was, and I would say is, unhurried. So an unhurried life is not about an empty calendar, it's about a full soul. And there's 4 words that I think describe the pace of Jesus. I think his is a pace of prayer, and this is on your notes as the outline. I think his is a pace of prayer. I think his is a pace of grace. I think it's a pace of peace. And I think it's a pace of love. In Luke's story of Jesus, Luke maybe does the best job of the 4 Gospels of highlighting rhythms of prayer in the life of Jesus. Sometimes just read through the entire Gospel of Luke and notice how many times Luke has him stepping back to be with the Father somehow. Just before he chooses his 12, he spends a night on the mountainside. In Luke 5, verse 16, we have this line. Luke's way of putting it is that Jesus often withdrew to lonely places to pray. Jesus often withdrew to lonely places to pray. I've thought about that line a lot. I've begun to think that that description of Jesus could be a facet of our own discipleship to him. If Jesus does this often, if Jesus does anything often, that'd probably be a good thing for me as his student to learn as well. Why does he withdraw to lonely places to pray? Well, Luke isn't specifically clear as to exactly why it is Jesus does this. But I think that the tone of the Gospels makes it clear, maybe in the Gospel of John we see this best, that Jesus is always saying something like, you know, these words I'm speaking, they're not my own. I only speak what I hear the Father saying. My works are not my own. I only do that which I see the Father doing. My judgments are not my own, he says. How does he know what's on the Father's heart, what the Father's doing? Well, you could say, he's God. Okay, the end. Hard for us to be a student of that. Any of you tried to be God for a day? Well, actually, we all try to do it quite often. It just doesn't work so well. But Jesus, who comes and lives in the power of the Holy Spirit, comes and enables us to follow him in that same life of the Spirit. And in that, what I've found is that building into my busy, often busy life, seasons where I withdraw to lonely places to pray, that's where I get my best ideas. That's where I get insight into things that are absolutely puzzling me. That's where I find courage to engage some of the challenging situations I find myself in. I withdraw to lonely places, and I remember who God is. And I remember who I am. And I remember what he's invited me to. One of his images for this student relationship we have with him, being a disciple to him as the rabbi, is a yoke, right? Somehow in my 20s, I imagined that the yoke experience was something like Jesus was carrying it, this big beam of wood with the two loops of wood for the two animals that would pull it. And then he sort of tossed it over to me. Okay, now I got the yoke. Okay, I got to carry my yoke. That's what he said. So I'm going to carry my yoke now. Okay, and it's like somehow Jesus isn't here anymore. Now I got a yoke. I really think that the image Jesus meant for us to feel is to take my yoke, is that he's in the yoke. And he says, would you join me here? I'm doing something the Father sent me to do. I would love you to be with me, and I'd love to do this together. Does the yoke of ministry ever feel heavier than Jesus says it's supposed to be? My yoke is easy. My burden is light. And something in you says, why doesn't it feel that way? Why does it feel heavier than what Jesus describes? And for me, part of the way I've come to experience his yoke as a better fit, as not being burdensome, is this idea, Jesus is with me. Better said, I'm with him. As a young person, I thought of myself as inviting Jesus into my life. That was the language we used. When I walked forward at a Billy Graham crusade, that was the invitation. Invite Jesus into your life. Nothing wrong with that at all. Changed my life to respond to that prayer. But the longer I go, the more it seems fitting instead to say, Jesus is inviting me into his life. Jesus is inviting me into his work. You know who's a really good shepherd? An excellent pastor? I mean, he's really good. Not just good in the moral sense, good in the skill sense. good in the vision sense, good in the caring for sheep sense. You will not find a better shepherd than Jesus. And guess who you have as a shepherd? You have Jesus. What's been burdening you? Jesus is with you, right in it. That concern that's just kicking the spokes out of your tires, you're not alone there. So again, unhurried is about remembering that. One of the hardest psalm invitations, it's really a command, is the one that says, "Be still and know that I am God." Me, I just want to go do something. Just do something. And of course, there's plenty of good things to do. But one of the things God invites us to do, at least in part, is to be still. And so a minute of quiet as we began. Or sometimes in the middle of a very busy day to just stop. I work out of my home, and during COVID, I only worked out of my home. And in California, we did that longer than almost anybody. And so we set up bird feeders because I took Jesus very seriously. Look at the birds. Matthew 6. I don't think he was exactly recommending bird watching in that exact spirit. But when you watch birds, they rarely look anxious. The crows sound angry, but birds rarely sound anxious. In fact, anymore now, when I get up in the morning, I listen for them. You know, if the birds are singing, there's no danger. If they're not singing, there's danger somewhere nearby. If you hear birds singing, it's because they're not feeling threatened. Consider the birds. They don't plant, they don't reap. We'll talk about some of this tomorrow because it's this sense of anxiety that often has been what revs me on the inside and makes it hard for me to be where I am. And therefore, say the sort of things Jesus might say if he were in my place, or do the sort of things Jesus might do if he were where I find myself. So the pace of prayer, one of my mentors used to say, prayer is not mostly a thing I do. It's mostly a person I'm with. I've sometimes thought of prayer as all my disciplines and all the books that I'm reading and the passages that I'm studying. And of course all of that's part of it. But that's like calling the bricks and the mortar and the plaster where I live my home. It's not my home, that's my house. My home, that has to do with the people who live there with me. The boys aren't there anymore, the men. But my wife and I now, almost 40 years, that's home. The relationships, that's home. My relationship with God, that is home. God is the center of my life of prayer. And so, let me just walk very briefly through that phrase, Jesus withdrew to lonely places to pray. What does it look like for you to find some time to be with God, not to prepare something for ministry, but to just enjoy his presence? What I've realized is, as a pastor, I got into the habit of just, all my time with God was professional. I'm embarrassed to say that. And I would say, well, it all counts. Of course it all counts. God's always with you. I'm not arguing about that. But Jesus withdrew to lonely places to pray. I wonder why he did that. One of the things I want to say is that when you withdraw, when you are not surrounded by the crowds, when your moment is not filled with some activity that you're responsible for, you remember that you are not what you do. You are not what you achieve. You are not what people say about you. You are who God says you are. And it's when you withdraw that you can best remember that. When I'm doing great and I feel like God loves me, something in the back of my head says, well, of course you love me. Look at all the great stuff I'm doing for you. I'm just being honest. If I'm in a really bad season when I feel like my faithfulness has been very faint and what I've been producing is not very impressive, then I'm tempted to say, yeah, you couldn't love me now. So when I withdraw, one of the things I learn when that becomes a rhythm over time is that I am the beloved. And I'm loved when I'm not doing anything yet. I don't do things to be loved. I am loved, so I do things. I don't serve in ministry to be impressive. I don't serve in ministry to prove who I am. I serve in ministry to express who I am. Who I am is decided. The crowds that I may serve don't name me. They don't tell me who I am. I get to go and share who God is. I get to do it from security, not trying to produce security. Again, all of this is the spirit of what I mean by unhurried. So the pace of prayer. It's also a pace of grace. One of the lines in my devotional that I wrote is that the grace of God is the atmosphere of God's kingdom, and we live by inhaling grace. One of my mentors used to say, we are saved by grace. Ephesians 2, nobody's going to argue. That doorway into the kingdom, that doorway into the life of faith, it's a door of grace. I don't come with money. I don't come with resume. I don't come with anything impressive. I come with empty hands to receive the gift of God. We are saved by grace. But then he would say, but after that first step through the doorway of grace, there is before you a pathway of grace. And so you live by grace, and you serve by grace, and you minister by grace, and you lead by grace. You do everything you do as a response to God's initiative, God's empowering presence, God's gracious provision. Your life, at its very best, is sharing what God's already given you. The kingdom operates at the pace of grace. I had this strange idea as a young Christian. I imagined that at that time, 18 and then young 20s, man, do I need a lot of grace. I've made such a mess of my life. God bless me at 18, 20. I mean, you can make a mess, but I can make bigger messes in my 30s and 40s and 50s. I mean, come on. Got more capacity, more ability, more authority. I can really make messes now if I decide to. I'm not trying to. And I somehow imagined that in my teens or my 20s, that the trajectory of my life with God was that I was going to need lots of grace now, and then less, and less, and less, until someday, I don't know, 50s, maybe now 60s, I'd hardly need grace at all. I got this wired. I got it figured out. I've matured. I've arrived. I know how everything works. Hardly need any grace at all. Like grace would be the spare tire in my trunk. I'm glad I have it. I hope I never need it. No. If grace is a car part, it's an engine. Dallas used to say, hey, saints burn grace in ways sinners never will. Saints burn grace like a 747 on takeoff. You need more grace the longer you go. What else does Paul mean when he tells Timothy, grow in grace? What does that look like? Well, in part, in my experience, it's looked like realizing how many ways I need grace. It's been coming to realize that everything I do is just an expression of grace. That it's not about me, but it's about Christ in me, being blessed by Him, and then having been blessed, becoming a blessing. Pace of prayer, pace of grace, pace of peace. It's been about a year since my book, A Non-Anxious Life, came out, and one of the seeds of that book was just sort of a imaginative prayer. When I wrote An Unhurried Life, I wanted to think about what would it look like if I started realizing that the Jesus I follow is an unhurried Savior. What would that do to the pace of my life? For that book, A Non-Anxious Life, I thought about what difference would it make if instead of only once a year, I remembered every day that he's the Prince of Peace. Jesus, the Prince of Peace. This is one of the most anxious times of my lifetime as I'm watching young adults overwhelmed by anxiety, a sense of placelessness, the sense of non-rootedness, the sense of everything's up for grabs, the overwhelming sense of anxiety. The kingdom is a kingdom of peace, and the king, he's a Prince of Peace. One of the things I've been learning, because I realized when I was writing this book, I thought of my anxiety as an asset. Isn't that dumb? Like, it got me moving. It pushed me to high standards. I got a lot done. What could be wrong with that? I can tell you, if you're curious. If anxiety's fuel, my experience is it's fuel that burns dirty. After a while, it's not so good for my body, or for my emotional health, or for my relationships, or practically speaking, for the quality of what I do in ministry. If peace is fuel, it's green. It's sustainable. It works even better a year from now than it did this year. Peace gives you access to fuel sources like love. Paul says the love of Christ compels me. Gives you access to energy sources like joy. The joy of the Lord does what? Strengthens you. Peace gives you access to hope. A sense of a future that is good because God's already there. The God of hope, already there. All of this I come to access as I slow down inside and remember who God is and that God is with me in everything I do, in my life and in my work. And so I've come to believe that anything I can do driven by anxiety, I can just do a lot better, led by peace. Peace has become a much better place from which to do what God's invited me to do. A place of prayer, of grace, of peace, of love. Finally, great commandment. It's not a mystery. If I gave you a test, you'd all get 100%. You know the answer to that. You know what Jesus said when he was asked. What matters most? What is the kingdom about? That's not exactly the question that was asked. But that's the spirit of the answer Jesus gives. The kingdom is a kingdom of love. God is a God of love. The ways of God, and Jesus is sent to show the love of God to the world. This is the great commandment. But you can't love people in a hurry. Love just takes time. The Good Samaritan story, right? The Levite and the priest, they've got important things to do for God. Got to get to Jerusalem. And then the bad guy, supposedly the Samaritan, he's not supposed to be the good guy in anybody's story. He's the one who stops and helps the guy and puts him on his donkey and takes him to an inn and pays for the room and leaves him there overnight and promises to come back the next day. Love is unhurried. And often, love looks like the interruptions in your day. I've come to realize, I'm not saying that every interruption is holy. Some of them definitely are not. Sometimes what you would define as an interruption, because you've got a wonderful plan for your life and a wonderful plan for your day. Nothing wrong with planning. I'm a planner. One of my mentors used to say, plan well, then hold them loosely. Because some of the most important things God's done in me and through me were not on my calendar when that day began. those divine appointments, those surprises that arose unexpectedly. So much of ministry is not the stuff we do when we're standing behind a mic. We get to do this a little bit. So much of ministry is just the everyday, mundane conversations that we have in passing. Those, in many ways, are the things people will never forget. If you ask people about a sermon I preached 30 years ago, nobody would remember them. If you ask them something about our relationship 30 years ago, much better chance they're going to remember that. The kingdom is a kingdom of love, and love cannot be hurried. When I'm hurried, I begin to define my life as things I need to manage. When I slow down, I realize my life is full of people I get to love. So that's a little bit about what I mean when I talk about unhurried. What I'm trying to do in my own life is I'm trying to follow the way of Jesus, who always had time for the Father no matter how crowded the crowds got. Like when the crowds are really excited, isn't it tempting to just keep serving the crowds, maybe get them a little bit bigger? Some job security, right? Jesus didn't seem to think that way. I'd say he withdrew from the crowds for the sake of the crowds. I think the crowds needed him to withdraw every once in a while. They needed him every once in a while to keep remembering, I'm not the person who draws crowds. I'm the beloved Son of the Father, who goes to the crowds to be a servant, not to be served. If I don't withdraw every once in a while, I'll start thinking the crowd defines me. That's great when they're your fan. But sometimes the crowds are fickle. Has that ever happened to you? You don't want them naming you. It's great when they like you. It's not a lot of fun when they don't. It's so much better to keep remembering to slow down to the pace of grace and peace and love. So, I wonder if one of those words rings true. I'm going to invite you, and these questions are on your little worksheet there, just to talk at your tables for a few minutes. Maybe even in twos or threes, since your table, some of you as many as 7 or 8. Just twos, threes. Talk about these questions. What does this idea of unhurried, how does it strike you as a good thing, as a way of seeing Jesus? What feels inviting about it? What feels challenging about it? Maybe even how do you wrestle with it? And after a few minutes, we'll come back together and I'll ask maybe if a couple of you would just share something from that conversation. Okay? So go ahead, at your tables. Talk about those questions. I hope you were enjoying some good conversation at your tables. I want to just take a moment for maybe 2 or 3 of you to share, if someone wants to, that is, something maybe that came up at your table that you thought was important and maybe the rest of us would appreciate, or maybe there's a question that came up in your time. Anybody who has something from that conversation you'd like to share with the community?
I see that, man.
Thanks, Barry. Here it comes. Nice.
Hurry.
Yes.
The buses will wait. Yeah.
Can you just restate this idea of the lighter yoke? You were
Just a minute ago.
Here we go. I'm on.
you were distinguishing. It was sort of like a symptom, something that was coming up during your day where you recognized, I'm not carrying this lighter yoke. Could you restate that? That were you experiencing?
Thank you. So, what I realized that the yoke gets heavier when I add my anxiety to it. The yoke gets heavier when I imagine I'm carrying it alone. When I think that ministry is something I do for God, instead of being something I do with God. The little words count. When I used to think of ministry for God, it's like God was 3 states away at the home office. And I was out here at the satellite office doing stuff for him. That's not how it works, but that's kind of what was going on inside of me. 2 things make the yoke lighter. I'm not alone in it, and Jesus is carrying the heavy yoke. Always, always, he's the one carrying the heavy yoke. So, thank you. right here.
So, as the inviting part, the idea that we can have this is an opportunity for us to have. And knowing is one thing, but believing, trusting, and living that out is a whole other.
It is.
And so when we know that we can experience His power and His grace, let's go. Let's go, you know? This is beautiful. This is a beautiful invitation.
Thank you. See, you know, we've heard, like, legend has it that Martin Luther would say at times, I have such a busy day today, I need 3 hours in prayer, not 2. I remember as a young leader thinking, oh, that is so spiritual and totally impractical. Right? Can you empathize with that? The longer I go, the more I think it's genius. Again, this next talk, I'm going to talk about work and rest. We don't have a good rest ethic. We have an amazing work ethic as Western, North American, U.S. Christians. Work ethic off the charts. And that's beautiful. But Jesus came to give us rest too. And that is not one of our cultural strong suits. And the best work grows in the soil of good rest. So, I'll say more about that in a minute, but you do not take time away from ministry to spend time in prayer. You give birth to ministry when you spend time in prayer. I get more done Sabbath-wise, the language of Sabbath. I get more done in 6 days than I can ever get done in 7. And by that I mean, if I keep running and I never rest, I start working at 60% and 40% and 30%. Just do the math. You're not getting as much done as you think you are. The tireder I am, the more frantic busyness that doesn't matter very much I fill my life with. The more rested I am, the more I know what's next. The more I can see what Jesus might be inviting me to do in this particular portion of the day. Sorry. That's just a few thoughts. Maybe one more.
That people at our table kind of come up with, don't give the people you are ministering to the feeling that you are hurried with them, because then they don't feel like they're important enough.
That is so well said. Thank you. I think one of the great gifts we can give people is learning to be with them with an unhurried soul. There's been a lot of talk about being a non-anxious presence, right? I think we overestimate our organizational influence, and many of us here have organizational influence and responsibility. And I think we underestimate our relational influence. They both matter. I'm not trying to diminish one and just make the other the only thing. But I really think that in the moments where you're just crossing paths with somebody for 2 minutes, that is a leadership opportunity. That is an opportunity to be a mentor. That is an opportunity to be an encourager. One of my mentors said, never make the mistake of thinking leadership is a light switch. Like, oh, now I'm behind the mic. On. Now I'm a leader. Here we go. Oh, mic's done. Yeah, they're leading now. I don't have anything to do. I don't know. Most of your leadership life does not happen behind the mic. You are always there to be a servant. Always there to be a blessing. Always there to do something good, even if it's not on your job description. Again, when I slow down, I notice those opportunities. When I'm frantically hurried with the schedule I've planned for myself, I run past them often. Okay, the second thing that I want to share with you is in your book, what page? Page 12. Okay? And this is the idea of, the subtitle of my first book is Following Jesus' Rhythms of Work and Rest, an Unhurried Life. If I had a chance to have that redone, I might change the subtitle to Following Jesus' Rhythms of Rest and Work, because I think that sequence actually makes sense, and I'll share why I think that makes sense in a moment. So, get my notes here. In this session, just between now and when we break in about 20 minutes, I'm just going to share a few thoughts that I hope will provide some framework for this idea that Jesus has a kind of rhythm of rest and work, of work and rest. And a lot of these insights came in, or at least planted in the midst of a sabbatical I took the year I turned 40, 25 years ago. I was part of a nonprofit, and we had a 1-year sabbatical policy, you can imagine, a year. Now people hear that and think, man, you had a long vacation. What I want to say to you is, if you've never taken a sabbatical is very much like what Henry Nouwen says about solitude, silence, and prayer. It's the furnace of transformation. A sabbatical, if you do it right, is like a blast furnace of transformation. People imagine that a sabbatical is therapeutic. It might be, but it's more often diagnostic. It's more often the long pause of the things that normally fill your life raises up within you the things Jesus would like to heal. Why do you get angry in those situations? You have certain situations that just push your buttons and you do a 10 of anger for a 3 situation. In our first apartment, there was my fist print in the closet wall. I'm not proud to say that, but there was a lot of anger in me, and I wasn't learning how to bring it to Jesus, and so it came out when I didn't want it to. In Sabbath, in sabbatical, when we withdraw to lonely places, it's not just to get some therapeutic benefit from the Spirit of God. Of course God's a comforter, and of course God gives us peace, and of course He's the God of eternal encouragement, as one of the Thessalonian letters says it. But often what happens when we rest is that's the moment where Jesus can address those places in us that need to be redeemed, need to be healed, need to be filled. And so in that year, I experienced some very deep depression. Hooray! Isn't that fun? Why? What is that? Eventually that led me to pursue some counseling. I am a fan of men and women who are trained and skilled to help walk us through places where Jesus might want to heal us inwardly. We used to call that soul care centuries ago. That was the word for it. It's a word that's coming back into visibility. Souls need to be cared for. And rest is one of the things that souls need to experience care. In that year, I was drawn to a line in Hebrews chapter 4. It's where the writer of Hebrews says, "Let us therefore make every effort to enter His rest," that rest. Isn't that an odd phrase? Make every effort. Okay, that sounds like you're really doing something. Working hard, you're trying hard. Make every effort. Okay, to do what? To enter His rest. What? What do you mean? Make every effort is leading to enter His rest. You know what that says to me? Resting is a lot harder than you think it is. When I'm overly tired, the hardest thing for me to do is rest. The easiest thing for me to do is stay busy. Does that ring true to anybody? When I'm tired, it feels like resting is work. Like it'd just be easier to turn on the tube and watch it for 3 hours. I'm not anti-television. There's ways of watching television that are life-giving and wonderful and enjoying the creativity of people. There's ways of just shutting off, like flick. There's a difference between resting and numbing. There's a great difference between resting and numbing. Resting leaves you feeling refreshed, renewed, alive, at peace, maybe some joy, maybe some holy energy. That's what resting produces in us. Numbing, well, the upside of it is for a minute you don't feel tired because you're numb. Except when the numb wears off, you're tired. This has been a long journey for me to identify when I get really tired, what does numbing look like? Food is one of those places, unfortunately. But true rest, you know you've rested if you feel like you've come alive a bit. I don't know if you've had this experience, but if you're just so exhausted that all you can imagine doing is turning on a TV or opening up a screen or something. And you get to the end of 2 hours or 3 hours doing that. I have never once at the end of that said, wow, I feel alive! Usually I feel mildly depressed. I can't believe I just did that. What helps you rest? It's a very good question to ask yourself. How do you know you've rested? And back to the Hebrews line, make every effort to enter his rest says it takes a bit of intentionality. It takes a bit of effort. It's not just put it in neutral and coast down the hill. Resting takes a bit of intentionality. In the late 80s, when I was in my late 20s, I was a full-time student at Fuller Seminary. I was a full-time college pastor at a large San Fernando Valley church, and I was newly married. And I'm embarrassed to say my priorities were probably in that order. And in my late 20s, I started hitting burnout. I would spend all day either at seminary or in the office or in some ministry event with college students. And I would come home to our guest room, turn the lights off, lay on the couch, and stare at the ceiling. Not a sign of soul health. I would do that day after day. And I had a crisis of ministry. It wasn't really a crisis of faith. I think I still had a belief that Jesus was who Jesus said he was, but I knew I couldn't keep doing ministry how I was doing it. Not only in my 20s. If you're getting burnout in your 20s, boy, that's bad pacing. You know? I feel so for my young brothers and sisters who are getting exhausted being involved in the work of ministry so early in their journey. It was at that point that God brought some men, 4 in particular men into my life. They were 10, 15, 25 years ahead of me in their journey with Christ and in their work of ministry. And they weren't exhausted. And they were at least as busy as I was. They had more responsibility than I had. And so what was it? And basically, they just reintroduced me to Jesus. And they introduced me to a Jesus who was inviting me first to come as friend and not imagine to come first as servant. Remember that line in the upper room? He says to his inner servants, I don't call you servants. I call you friends. I want to show you what the Father is doing. See, servants visit the table. Friends sit at the table. We're friends. Jesus is inviting us into friendship with him. And his is a restful presence. I mean, he's the one who once, when the disciples were just in this frantic season of ministry where they hadn't even had time to eat, he's the one who says, come away with me to a quiet place and find some rest for your soul. There was a season in my young 20s where I imagined that Jesus was my boss and he was only going to give me something to do every time I came to him. That's not saying something about Jesus. That's saying something about my vision of him. Like Jesus is just the one who gives assignments. But if that's your vision of Jesus, you're not going to want to pray too much. Especially if you feel like your to-do list is too long already. What you need is a vision of Jesus who says, yes, let's go into the world. Let's love the people that I've made and that my Father loves. Let's do that together. And by the Spirit, we can do that together today. And Jesus is the good shepherd. He said so in John 10. And he knows when we need to find ourselves in quiet pasture, beside quiet waters. He knows when we need nourishment. He knows when we need rest. He cares about that, and he's the kind of shepherd who will make us lie down if need be. So part of this unhurried idea is a vision of Jesus that is more biblical, if you need to use that language, if that helps. Not just the Jesus who invites us to go, and I would argue go with him, but the Jesus who invites us to come. Come to me. Come to me. Be my friends. He called those he wanted to be with him, it says in the Gospels. So all this talk about work and rest, it sort of begs the question of what is rest? And I've come to believe that rest is the fertile soil where good work grows. And by rest, I don't just mean physical rest, that's part of it. I'm talking about rest for our souls, rest from anxiety, rest from inner drivenness, rest from insecurity, rest from all of the kinds of restlessness that happen here. Sometime it'd be a really good little prayer exercise to sit down with an empty page of journal and ask yourself, what does restlessness look like in me these days? What does restlessness look like in me these days? Because I'll guarantee you something. Jesus would meet you there, will meet you there. Is it anxiety? Is it Prince of Peace? How many times does he say to his inner circle, peace be with you, or do not be afraid? And so Jesus meets us in whatever form restlessness takes. Remember the familiar line? We've mentioned the idea of a yoke, but in Matthew 11 we hear those familiar words. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. He doesn't just say that to you when you're coming for the first time. He's saying that to you now in your exact role, right now, where you find yourself. How do you find yourself weary or burdened these days? Jesus would meet you there and give you rest. Let me just make a quick case in my last few minutes before we close our session. In our cultural imagination, which comes first, work or rest? Not work, right? Work. In our cultural vision, work comes first and is primary, and rest is the thing you do when you just can't work anymore. And you only do that as long as you need to recharge the battery to go back and work. So rest is like work with a red slash through it. It's defined in the negative. Rest is not working. Is that the biblical definition of rest? No. In the scriptures, in the kingdom of God, rest is a something. So, for example, think of the creation story. Day 1, 2, 3, God makes a universe and a world and light and dark and land and sea, and he just says, let it be, and it does. Pure grace. Didn't have to do it. Wanted to do it. He's an artist. He needs to create. Day 4, 5, 6, flora and fauna. And day 6, who? Us. Right? We come on the scene. The very next day, day 7, what kind of a day is it? It's a day of rest. Our first full day as human creation is not a work day. It's a rest day. Creation begins in rest. It begins in fellowship. It begins with presence. It begins in communion. It begins in a place of presence with God. And then our first father and mother go into this world God's made to tend it. The Jewish rabbis, one by the name of Abraham Heschel, used to say, Sabbath may be last in order, but it's first in intention. Sabbath is in part what's at the heart of this Hebrews 4, make every effort to enter his rest. Not just a weekly calendar Sabbath, but an eternal Sabbath. A rest that's forever, that we can start to enter now. So rest precedes work in the rhythm of creation. The other thing I want to think about, typically when you think of a day beginning, when does the day begin? This morning, my alarm went off at 5:15. I wish it didn't, but it did. And in many imaginations, that's when the day begins. The alarm has hit, and off we're running. In that imagination, the day begins with work and ends with rest. In the Jewish imagination, when does the day begin? You know, sundown. So the first half of the Jewish day, at least in theory, is rest that then gives birth to work. Eugene Peterson, in one of his books, Working the Angle, said this: the Hebrew evening-morning sequence conditions us to the rhythms of grace. We go to sleep and God begins his work. As we sleep, he develops his covenant. We wake and we're called out to participate in God's creative action. We respond in faith, we respond in work, but always grace is previous, grace is primary. We wake into a world we didn't make, into a salvation we didn't earn. Evening. God begins, without our help, his creative day. Morning. God calls us to enjoy and share and develop the work he initiated. Creation and covenant are sheer grace and there to greet us every moment. It takes faith to rest. It really does. A lot of us have a serious case of the indispensabilities. The world will not survive without us, we imagine. When I've been a pastor, I imagine that I am utterly indispensable. But it doesn't work when I try to practice pastoral omnipresence. Only one person in the universe can be omnipresent. It's not me. God is everywhere. God is everywhere. And so I can trust that when I rest, like taking a Sabbath, or stepping away to something like this, Jesus is still involved in the lives of the people who shepherd, who care for. He's doing what you can't do because you're sitting at a table listening to some guy up front talk about unhurried something or other. And he is good at what he does. And he so wants you to learn how to do what he does, how he does it. He does what he does restfully. He does what he does as a Prince of Peace. He does what he does empowered by the grace and the truth of his Father. Jesus is never in a hurry, but he gets more done in 3.5 years than I've managed to get done in 40. Unhurried is not about getting less done. It's about doing what matters. So, when we get this sequence backward, we imagine that we work, collapse, and we label that rest. Instead, what we could say is, God's inviting me to rest. And in that place of rest, I enjoy him, and I come to see his vision for the world that he's sending me into, that we're going into together. I work very differently from that spirit. The last thing I'll say in my 2 minutes. This comes from a friend of mine. His name is A.J. Swoboda. He's written one of my favorite books on the theme of Sabbath. Subversive Sabbath is its title. And he had this little line in it. I'm borrowing it, but I'm giving him credit because it's his idea, not mine. He said, do you know that the Bible has a word for the person who works 0 days and rests 7 days? What are some candidates for this person? What are some words the Bible might use? Sluggard, oh man, I have a visual, like sluggard, oh goodness. What else? Sloth, I think I heard. The more garden variety word? Lazy. Absolutely, the Bible has a word for the person who doesn't work and thinks they're resting. Here's the problem. Laziness is the most restless human condition you can imagine. It never leads to rest. It leads to anxiety. It leads to the absolute opposite of rest. It's an arrhythmia of the soul. It is not good for us. But then AJ says, but you know too, the Bible has a word for the one who works 7 days and rests 0. What might that word be? You could say disobedient. That'd probably be true. Think about this. The word in the Bible for that person is slave. Israel in Egypt cannot observe the Sabbath. They must work day after day after day after day without rest. When we don't rest, we're behaving as though we are slaves of our work. But we just said in John 15, Jesus does not call us servants, especially in that sense. He calls us friends. And he loves being friends in work. But he also loves being friends in the rest. Don't you love having a moment with a good friend? Doing something important together? Isn't that great? But don't you also love those moments when you just sit over a meal, you just catch up, you're not trying to produce something, you're not trying to impress somebody? Our friendship with Jesus and our work with Jesus. It happens in the rhythms of work and rest, of rest and work. During the break, I'll be back at the table. We brought copies of my books. These 2 little talks this morning have been from An Unhurried Life, but there are 4 others back there. I'd love to visit with you during the break before you move on to your workshops. I'm going to hand it back to somebody, Barry or whoever. Okay, here we go. Thanks, friend.